Good morning. It's April 5th here in Seoul and also a very rainy Arbor day. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with Donald Trump's appearance in a Manhattan court. Donald Trump pleads not guilty to over 30 felony charges. He is now set to speak back at home in Mar-a-Lago in the coming minutes. Finland becomes the 31st nation to join NATO, doubling the length of member states' borders with Russia. While Washington welcomes its newest ally, Moscow warns it will beef up its defense. Here in the nation, the president uses a veto power for the first time to reject a legislation mandating a government purchase of surplus rice. It's also the first use of veto power by a South Korean leader in 7 years. An ex-American president faces a Manhattan court indicted with 34 felony counts. Donald Trump is accused of paying hush money and falsifying business records. To fill us in what these charges are and the latest developments regarding the historic case, our Kim Hyun-sung is on the line. So, Hyun-sung, let's start with the specifics of these charges.
Right. Thank you, Dami. Former U.S. President Donald Trump is accused of paying hush money to pipe down claims that could have hurt his chances at the polls during his presidential campaign back in 2016. And this includes payoffs made to two women, including adult film star Stormy Daniels, with whom he allegedly had extramarital sexual relations with and paid substantial amounts of money to keep their encounter under wraps. But let me be clear, Tommy. Hush money is not illegal. But what is illegal is Donald Trump's tinkering with his company's books because he logged these hush payments as legal fees, which falls as illegally falsifying business records under New York state law. And there are over 30 more cases where the grand jury of the County of New York has indicted Trump over accusations of falsifying records in the first degree, which means that he had intent to defraud and intent to conceal the commission of another crime. And all these charges are Class E felonies, meaning that each count carries a maximum prison sentence of 4 years. And if Trump is found guilty on all 34 counts, he could be facing up to 136 years behind bars. And Donald Trump pleaded not guilty, with his defense team claiming that he's being unjustly charged. Trump is seen as one of the most influential men in the U.S., not only as the former commander-in-chief, but also as a business mogul and a key player in real estate. He's also one of the most controversial. He's been mired in a string of scandals and faced an array of criminal investigations, but he has never been charged. In fact, no former American president has ever been criminally charged before him.
So, as widely expected, Trump did plead not guilty to all those charges. Then, what is he saying about the situation at the moment?
Well, he's supposed to be addressing his most avid supporters shortly at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, where he has invited about 500 of his most prominent supporters, including some of the most pro-Trump congressional Republicans. Ahead of his arraignment, however, Donald Trump remained defiant, calling the New York State court a kangaroo court and saying that this is not what America is supposed to be. And this story is obviously developing as we speak, so I'll be sure to bring you more updates in our later newscast. Back to you, Dami.
Thank you, Hyun-sung, for keeping us updated. Now, moving on, European leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, are heading to China for talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. What for? After putting a sharp edge on China over the possibility of Beijing sending military aid to Russia for the Ukraine war. And discussion on human rights and trade are also on the agenda. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
Both French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen arrived in China on Wednesday. Their trip is part of a 3-day visit to hold talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping aimed at discussing Ukraine as well as trade and human rights issues. While experts don't expect any major outcome from the talks with Xi, the two European leaders are expected to push Beijing to limit their support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Others believe that the trip is just part of efforts to re-engage with China, with it being Macron's first to China since 2019 and von der Leyen's first as head of the European Union's executive arm. The trip also comes as von der Leyen expressed concerns over the EU's relations with China becoming more distant in recent years.
It is clear that our relations have become more distant and more difficult in the last few years. We've seen a very deliberate hardening of China's overall strategic posture for some time. And it has now been matched by a ratcheting up of increasingly assertive actions.
Meanwhile, President Macron is also expected to visit the Chinese city of Guangzhou. Macron is currently traveling with a group of over 50 CEOs, including French energy giant EDF, rail transport manufacturer Alstom, and European plane maker Airbus. Experts say Paris is trying to maintain and rebalance trade relations with Beijing. So the question remains, will the two European leaders be able to pressure China into limiting their support for Russia, while also calling for better trade relations? Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power Corporation is reportedly facing some hurdles from the U.S. as it seeks to transfer nuclear technology to the Czech Republic. According to documents submitted by KHNP to the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, it had submitted a letter last December informing the U.S. Department of Environment of the export bid, a necessary step to export related technology under U.S. law. But the DOE, in reply, asked the company to submit the letter in cooperation with the U.S. company Westinghouse. Westinghouse helped KHNP during the early stages of its nuclear development, and the two are currently engulfed in a lawsuit over whether KHNP's nuclear technology should be subject to export controls by the U.S., which allow exports only to approved countries. KHNP said it will comply with the request. The South Korean government plans to expand the number of core strategic technologies for materials, parts, and equipment from 150 to 200. The country's first trade minister, Chung Young-jin, said on Wednesday that South Korea will also increase the number of leading companies that possess them to 200 companies by 2030. Those companies are given environment and employment deregulation, as well as tax credits for investment and acquisition of local and overseas firms that produce materials, parts, and equipment. Currently, 66 leading companies have core strategic technologies for materials, parts, and equipment. President Yoon Suk-yeol has used veto power for the first time to reject a legislation mandating a government purchase of surplus rice. Now, it's also the first use of veto power by a South Korean leader in 7 years. Our political correspondent Lee Si-hoo reports.
Rival lawmakers at the National Assembly questioned government officials on Tuesday, focusing on the economy this time. On the second day of the three-day interpellation, the Prime Minister and the Ministers of Finance, Agriculture, and Transport, among others, were in attendance. Lawmakers asked them questions involving the rising energy bills, low birth rate, and South Korea's economic relations with Japan. The key question of the day was on the recently passed revision of the Grain Management Act, which President Yoon Suk-yeol had vetoed earlier on Tuesday.
What was the main reason for the veto?
We think the law forcing the government to purchase surplus rice is not helpful to farmers or to our finances. Researchers say that purchasing surplus rice would lead to overproduction, which would eventually lead to a fall in price.
The opposition, which last month pushed for the passing of the bill, called for better treatment of the farming industry.
I think the government should treat our agricultural industry well. It's helped our economy become the 8th largest in the world. What do you think?
I completely agree with the agricultural sector's contribution to South Korea's economic advancement, but the problem is the agricultural environment is rapidly changing. Demand is decreasing, and I think it's time we employ policies that suit the needs of farmers.
The revised Grain Management Act calls on the government to buy surplus rice if demand falls short of production by 3 to 5%, or if prices fall by 5 to 8% or more from the year prior. Now, this is the first time that President Yoon exercised his veto power, and also the first time the executive right was used since 2016. The vetoed act will now be put to a vote once again at the National Assembly. For it to pass, it requires over 2/3 of the votes of at least half of the parliament's lawmakers in attendance. If passed, the government has to accept the bill. But considering how 115 out of 299 lawmakers are part of the ruling People Power Party, making up over 1/3 of the parliament, it's widely expected that the bill will not pass the assembly this time. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
The South Korean government and the ruling People Power Party last week agreed to temporarily put off raising electricity and gas bills, a huge relief for households who have been battered by soaring bills in the past few months. But rate hikes are reportedly inevitable. For more on the issue, we're joined by Professor Kim Se-won. He's an economics professor at Ewha Women's University here in Seoul. Welcome back to the program, Professor.
Good morning.
Good morning. First off, what are the reasons behind the temporary postponement on electricity and gas rate hikes?
A quick answer to the question is because higher energy bill gives a big burden to general households, and also because it is more important than energy companies' business losses. Utility bills rose almost 28% on year last month, the highest among all sectors, and 6 times the 4.8% inflation. Given this situation, Korean government is taking longer than expected to announce new electricity and gas bills for the second quarter. The delay comes amid calls by politicians and the public to ease the burden of rising energy prices, even as public utility companies suffer mountain losses from artificially low rates. Mm-hmm. Since KEPCO and gas corporations' business losses can't be continued in the longer term, however, government will raise energy bills sometime in the second half of this year.
Right, then let's delve deeper into the issue. What happens if Korea Electric Power Corporation and Korea Gas Corporation fail to raise the price of gas and energy? What will happen next?
That is a very important question under this complicated situation. Mounting losses by public electricity and gas corporations are a big burden to Korean government too. Their losses should be compensated by government budget in the end, because these companies are owned and operated by Korean government. KEPCO's loss was over 32 trillion won last year, all-time high, while Korean gas corporations not received money from gas buyers, which is company's loss near 9 trillion won. Last year. The losses of these public companies will be financed through companies' bonds, and Korean Congress gave more room to sell more bonds to these companies. So energy companies' losses can give shocks to domestic bond market because these public companies' credits are simply the best in the market, and therefore private companies' bond sales will shrink in the end.
Right, it's a burden for both households and those corporations. But how long will these energy price hikes be put off? It's been postponed temporarily, but when will the government eventually go ahead with the raise?
As we talked about, energy bill would be raised in the second half of this year when Korean government hopefully relatively recovers. Actually, until the end of February, the Korean government believed that energy rate adjustment could be inevitable in the first half of this year. But still, higher inflation and declining domestic consumption enforced government to delay energy bill raise. Thanks to negative impacts of higher business losses of public energy companies, there is a strong voice that electricity and gas bills needs to be rationalized very soon. But it needs to be noted that there should be something support or aids for vulnerable groups like low-income households when energy bill increases.
Right. Briefly, Energy bills have always been a headache for South Korean households. But what is the energy bill situation like in other countries? Please do share with us one example that is noticeably different from South Korea. How are other countries managing or keeping gas and energy bills under control?
European countries are the most suffering from higher energy bills rise in the last 2 years. We say that unexpectedly warm weather in last winter saved Europeans because in some countries, households were about to borrow money from banks to pay skyrocketed energy bills. The annual energy inflation rate exceeded 40% last year in Europe, and then prices began to fall gradually. In last month's energy inflation was about 20% in European countries. However, many households and businesses still struggle with the cost of the energy. European governments have allocated significant support to households and businesses to mitigate the impact of larger energy bills in the middle of overall energy cost crisis. Among European countries, Hungary, Germany, and UK are the most suffering from higher energy bills of electric power and gas.
Right. It sounds like it's a burden for many countries, not just South Korea at the moment, though there are variables like climate change and the warmer weather affecting the situation.
That's
All
true.
Right. Yep. Thank you, Professor Kim, for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me today.
Day one in Busan for the inspection team tasked with choosing the winning bid for the World Expo 2030, as they were met by warm greetings by Busan citizens. And today, the delegation will head to the proposed main Expo venue, the Busan North Port. Our Shin Se-byuk has more.
The on-site three-day inspection in Busan has begun. An 8-member delegation from the Bureau International des Expositions arrived in the city on Tuesday and received a warm welcome from approximately 5,000 citizens in front of Busan Station. They were also greeted by different kinds of performances, including a demonstration of Korea's traditional percussion music, samulnori. During their 3-day stay, the inspection team will visit the proposed venues and landmarks and meet with city leaders and citizens. On their first day, the team visits Ulsukdo Ecological Park, followed by a bid presentation and a dinner hosted by the Busan mayor. On Wednesday, the delegation is set to visit Busan North Port, the proposed main expo venue. Later in the day, they will attend a K-Culture Night concert. The final day, which falls on Thursday, will consist of a final presentation, a visit to the UN Memorial Cemetery, and lunch with international students in Busan. The delegation will be leaving South Korea on Friday, marking the end of their month-long trip to the bidding countries. The team will then make a report based on its 6-day trip to South Korea. The report will include a comprehensive assessment of Busan, including the qualities of the venues, conditions of local public transportation, and Korea's financing plans to support the event. The report for the 4 bidding cities, Korea's Busan, Saudi Arabia's Riyadh, Italy's Rome, and Ukraine's Odessa, will be made available to the 171 BIE member states during the June General Assembly before voting for a winner in November. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Ashley, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. We begin in Brussels, as NATO has officially welcomed Finland as its 31st member. During a ceremony at NATO headquarters on Tuesday, Finland's flag was unfurled among those of fellow members of the military alliance. The ceremony fell on the same day as the organization's 74th founding anniversary. It means that NATO has doubled its frontier with Russia, as Finland and its neighbor share a border 1,300 kilometers long. It also means that Finland has now abandoned its 7 decades of military non-alignment. In response, US President Joe Biden issued a statement congratulating Finland and called for NATO members Türkiye and Hungary to quickly conclude the ratification processes that would allow Sweden to join as well. It also drew positive responses from Ukraine and the United Kingdom. But the move has been met with backlash from Moscow, which has threatened countermeasures. Meanwhile, in the Indian Himalayas, at least 7 people have been killed and over a dozen injured following a major avalanche. Now, it took place Tuesday morning local time near the Natula mountain pass in India's northeastern state of Sikkim. According to officials, the avalanche came after unseasonal rains and hit a road where several vehicles were carrying tourists. Rescuers were able to pull 20 people out of the snow alive and saved 350 tourists and 80 vehicles that were stranded. It's still unclear what triggered the avalanche, which also came at an unusual time of the year. Over the past 2 years, the Indian Himalayas have seen an increased number of such events, which have killed at least 120 people. Meanwhile, a 2018 study says that the region is at an increased risk for avalanches due to climate change. Turning over to Türkiye now, almost 2 months after the devastating earthquakes that struck the country and neighboring Syria, a mother and her baby daughter have finally been reunited. They were brought together at a hospital in the city of Adana on Monday after DNA testing confirmed they were related. They were separated during the February 6th earthquakes that hit their home in the province of Hatay. The baby girl has been called a miracle baby after she was pulled out of the rubble 5 days later with no injuries. However, her 2 brothers and father were among the 56,000 people killed by the earthquake and subsequent tremors across Türkiye and Syria. And finally, the cryptocurrency Dogecoin has seen its price surge after Twitter switched its iconic bluebird logo to the image used by the popular virtual coin, a Shiba Inu dog. Now, after Twitter made the change on Monday, the price of Dogecoin rose more than 30% in 3 hours. Musk is a known supporter of cryptocurrencies and has advocated for both Dogecoin and Bitcoin. Twitter has declined to say whether the logo change will stay. The logo change comes after Musk on Friday asked a U.S. judge to dismiss a $258 billion lawsuit that accuses him and his electric car company Tesla of running a pyramid scheme to support Dogecoin.
Good morning. Today is Arbor Day and also Cheongmyeong, the 5th spring term out of 6. It surely has been a rough spring for plants and trees this year, with a lack of rain amid a warming trend. Welcome rain is soaking the ground nationwide with heavier rain on Jeju and the south coast this morning. So the south coast and Jeju could see more than 100 millimeters of rain, with 20 to 30 millimeters of rain an hour to pound down in those areas. Meanwhile, the rest of the country will see 10 to 80 millimeters of rainfall until Thursday afternoon. Heavy rain alerts are in place for Jeju, and the strong wind advisory has also been issued on Jeju and the west coast for what will be a tough day for those on Jeju Island. So if you are flying in and out from the resort island, check your flight schedules in case of any cancellations. Morning temperatures are still above norms, while highs will be returning to norms this afternoon and it will be breezier tomorrow. Afternoon highs in Seoul and Gwangju will be at 16 degrees Celsius. Daegu, Gyeongju, Daejeon, Busan all topping out at 17 degrees. It's slippery out there, so stay safe on the roads today. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's A New Day at Arirang. Do stay with us for more updates throughout the day. Thanks for watching.